Now, despite the economy losing thousands of jobs due to ongoing lockdown and the pandemic, recovery time from infection is also causing problems and, in cases, job losses as well. Long COVID, as we know, can last for months after the initial infection. So what does this mean for employees and companies here in South Africa? Osborne Molatudi is an employment and labour law specialist, and he joins us now from Johannesburg. Mr. Molatudi, thank you so much for your time. You know, this long COVID thing is so interesting. We know that in the UK it's something they're really researching hard. Do you know if it's recognised here in South Africa as an actual sickness, and is it given the priority and the understanding that you think it deserves?
Good evening, Sally, and thank you for having me on your show. Yes, it is recognized. I mean, anything that affects the capacity of an employee to be able to carry out his or her employment duties, that will be recognized in terms of our law, because it goes to the ability of that employee to be able to continue rendering services to his or her employer. So COVID fatigue, or what is referred to as long COVID leave of absence, can be one of those grounds.
Of course, some people are having symptoms up to a year after having the initial infection, and it requires doctor appointments and just sometimes bed rest. At some point, you're going to run out of sick leave. What happens then? Are people losing their jobs because of things like long COVID in South Africa?
Well, fortunately in South Africa, as a starting point, we have our employment law, the one well-known one referred to as the LRA, which guarantees an employee the right not to be unfairly dismissed or be subjected to an unfair labor practice. Now, when it comes to the issue of illness or ill health, there's a detailed procedure that an employer is required to follow before that employer can consider terminating the services of the employee. And one of the more common one is that the employer must investigate other aspects that the employee can be accommodated before his or her employment is terminated. However, if the incapacity of the employee is such that it's for a longer period, then the employer will have to engage that employee on ways in which the employee can then be declared unfit to continue working, and on that basis, the employer will be entitled to terminate that employee's services.
What if you
But it's not something that an employer can just wake up and undertake. It has to be a process of engagement, consulting the employees, subjecting the employees to medical assessment, getting to study the employees' records and related before any decision to terminate that employee's employment is taken.
I think certainly COVID exposure has caused so many challenges in the workplace, and this is an issue that keeps coming up. If you've been exposed to COVID-19 and you're asked by your company to stay at home and isolate, must you take sick leave, or does the company just say, look, this is just a precaution, you must just stay at home, it won't impact any of your leave balances?
If the employee will not be expected to work from home while in self-isolation or in quarantine, then the employee will be expected to take sick leave. And that sick leave can be a special one in terms of the employer's COVID policy, or if there's no such policy, then unfortunately the Basic Conditions of Employment Act will have to kick in. And as we know, it stipulates a number of days that an employee is entitled for sick leave in a 3-year cycle. And unfortunately, if the employee would then exceed that statutory number of days, and in the absence of favorable days from the employer's policy, then that employee would unfortunately be on unpaid sick leave. But, you know, during this pandemic, most employers are expected to show some bit of empathy towards their employees and at least grant them a special leave, especially when they are sick, not because of their own making, but because of this pandemic that affects all of us in the workplace, in our communities, and everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems unfair that if you are not sick, you cannot work from home. Your job requires that you're in the office, but you're not sick, but you've been exposed, and yet you might be forced to take it out of your own sick leave. So that should you, let's say, in 3 weeks' time, get really ill with COVID, you're going into a negative balance with COVID. You say that there are sort of special concessions, and a lot of companies are looking at ways to make this not patently unfair. But do you think that this is something that isn't properly being addressed in the workplace currently in South Africa?
I think by now, I mean, coming from March 2020, this is something that should easily be addressed by employers and employee representatives, and in some instances, by employees themselves. I mean, we now know what our rights are, during this pandemic. I mean, the president has recently made an announcement in terms of certain restrictions, and it's expected that during this 14-day period, employers and employees and even employee representatives will be engaging one another as to how best to deal with the situation without affecting productivity of that employer. And again, we must bear in mind that an employer is in business to produce, and make money. And therefore, the moment there are certain restrictions imposed by our government, it is then expected that there should be engagement and not something that becomes an overnight decision that affects one party unfairly at the expense of the other.
Yes.
So I think by now, everyone should know their rights in terms of what should happen if there are restrictions, etc. And please, we should not discount the effectiveness of working from home, because in certain circumstances, some employees can be able to carry out their duties and responsibilities from home. Some can be given side office, not to be exposed to those who may be affected by the COVID.
And I think that's one of the really interesting things that we've all learned, that working from home can be done quite effectively. I want to ask you one final question about long COVID. Could it be recognised as a disability? And if it were recognised as a disability, would that give you extra concessions in the workplace? Indeed,
and depending on the employer's policy, it can be regarded as a disability if the employee's incapacity as a result of long COVID is such that he will not be able to recover, or it affects the carrying out of his or her duties severely. So it can be declared as a disability, and on that basis, the employer will be expected to comply with its own disability policy, or to simply follow the statutory one and assist that employee to access the benefits that pertain to disability. Remember, this is not the employee's own making. It's a pandemic that caught all of us by surprise. And therefore, once again, employers will be expected to show some empathy to those who may be affected by this COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. You're quite right. The middle ground has to be found between staying productive as a company and keeping everyone employed, and not being unfair on those who are genuinely ill and battling with long-term symptoms of COVID. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. That was Osborne Molatudi, an employment and labour law specialist, talking to us about the implications of long COVID in the workplace.